Hi, good evening, everyone. For those of you who are joining in from wherever you are across the northern American continent, all of that, my name is Danielle Parrish. I'm one of the lead pastors at Spark.Church, and we want to welcome you. We're glad you're here with us. We're in Palo Alto, Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and we just want to say a big welcome to all of you and thank you for joining on in. We are really delighted to host this live public conversation with Dr. Beth Allison Barr, and we are grateful for you to be here. Thank you, Beth, for joining us. Dr. Barr or Beth, what would your preference be?
Oh, Beth is perfectly fine.
Beth will be just fine. Great. Well, we
Yes.
have about 45 minutes of conversation scheduled for you all. We're just going to pick Beth's brain here and hear a little bit about her. So let me introduce her and we'll get started. We want to remind you that we have questions and comments available on YouTube, which I see some already joining on in. Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining us and all the rest of you. And we also have questions available for you through Slido. The event number is 53118, and you can upvote questions from one another and start thinking that through. So let me introduce our friend here, Beth. Dr. Beth Allison Barr is an associate professor of history and associate dean of the graduate school at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, where she specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. She is the president of the Conference on Faith and History and is a member of Christians for Biblical Equality. She has written for Christianity Today, the Washington Post Religious News Service, and is a regular contributor to the Anxious Bench on Pathos and Christian history. And she is here to talk with us about her new book that just came out this last week, with Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation to Women Became Gospel Truth. So welcome to Spark.Church, and we are very grateful to have you. Next time you have to come in person, our church is the best. We have to have you fly out to California.
I would love to. I have one of the residence hall director in the residence hall that I live in is from California. And so when I told her I was going to speak at a church, she was like, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, unfortunately, it's just virtual." So
it's still virtual, but hopefully not for long. And, the first time I ever heard your name was when Jamar Tisby came and spoke at Spark, one of the last times when we were still in person. And I had asked him this question about the connection between race and white supremacy and racism in the church, along with patriarchy and oppression of women. And he said, "I have a friend who is having this, she's working on a book right now," and he wrote your name down on a slip of paper, and I tucked it in and started following you immediately on Twitter. So that was some time ago now, and I'm just really grateful to have you here and be part of this conversation. So
thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. I've read your book. I've devoured it. I've been so grateful, taking furious notes, wishing we were in the same room so I could say yes, and all of these other things we want to talk about. So thank you for your book, for your diligent research, for the hard work, and for your story that you share personally and the vulnerability that you presented in the book. I appreciate how you wove that personal story into the historical data and narrative and good hard research that you were so accustomed to doing as a professor and as just a student of history. As you were telling your story, I found a lot of resonance with it personally, from having also been a youth pastor for many years and being at those National Youth Workers Conferences. And so
we were probably there at the same time.
We were probably there at the same time. I was the one who was always lobbying since my husband and I were married in 1998. I'd been lobbying since that moment for youth pastors' spouses hangout rather than the youth pastors' wives. And so finally, one day on the West Coast Conference, we got that going. We got the youth, and Kevin was the only one to show up, but that's okay. It was like youth fest. So anyway, National Youth Workers Convention, I also really resonated with your awkward women retreats where it wasn't quite the right fit at times, and commiserated with you in some of those journeys. So I'm really grateful for that story. But for those of our listening audience who've not had a chance to pick up your book yet, would you mind sharing a bit of your story and what occurred and how it prompted you to write this book?
Sure. I've said before that this book really is my life. It's also not a book I ever intended to write. My whole life, I have lived between two worlds. I've lived between the world of academia and the world of Southern Baptist complementarianism. And my husband and I got married 10 days before I started graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he started at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. So really, we have walked these two worlds together. And it wasn't, though, until 2016 that I suddenly realized I had to do something about it. By that point, I had become convinced that patriarchy was simply patriarchy, no matter what you called it, no matter how pretty you made it, that it was simply patriarchy and it was not godly. But it wasn't until the circumstances of the fall of 2016 when my husband got fired for us asking for a woman to teach youth Sunday school. That's what triggered it. And then at the same time, that's when Donald Trump got elected. And I sort of felt like my whole world was crumbling, because I was like, how am I living in a world where we are electing a president who has publicly said such disparaging things about women? And at the same time, we can't even recognize that a woman is called by God to teach other people. And so I didn't know what I was going to do at the time, but I felt, sort of, I guess, this burning in my stomach that something had to be done. And I started writing some posts on the Anxious Bench that eventually caught the eye of an editor who asked me if I would consider writing a book. So wow. That's the short version of the story.
Can I have you expand on that just a little bit? Would
Yes.
you mind telling everybody what happened when you were weary of keeping it in, indeed you could not, and you went to the church leadership and said, this is our conviction, and can we have this conversation? And it was
Yes.
a part of a community you'd been part of for 15 years, deeply connected to the kids, your husband's livelihood, all of this. How can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, it was an extremely hard moment. In fact, I write about this moment more than once within the book, because my husband and I knew at this point, we knew we could no longer really stay at a church that was so hardline complementarian if there wasn't going to be any movement within it. And I was becoming increasingly concerned about what my children were being taught at the church. I was feeling like I was having to do a lot of repair work at home. So we decided that we were just going to ask the question. We were just going to say, can we talk about this? Can we have a woman teach high school Sunday school alongside a man? It wasn't even
that's a really teaching. Low bar. I feel like
it was team teaching.
Right,
yeah, that's what
right.
we thought.
They can't vote yet. They can't. Right.
My gosh, we were really floored when the response we got was a hard no. And it really hit both of us. And I still remember, and I talk about this in the book, when my husband told me it was a hard no, he said, if we push this, I will lose my job. Right. And I have never forgotten those words. And part of me knew he was serious, but part of me was like, surely not. Right. It's like, they know us. Right. They know, surely. And so when it did happen, it really felt like, in fact, I didn't talk about this in the book, but the moment I got the message from my husband, there's like a few seconds that I don't actually know what happened. I found myself sitting down on a stone. I don't know how I got there. I still to this day don't remember. Mm-hmm. It was just like literally somebody had pulled my world out from underneath me, because I couldn't believe that just doing this would cause them to let us go, or to begin the process to say, you are no longer welcome here because you have a theology about women.
Well, so. and speaking as, the founding and lead pastor at a church, not even asking for female leadership of the church, just teaching kids.
Just teaching kids. I know. And so it really was. It was not. My husband he knew it was going to happen, because he was working with the pastors, and he knew, he was like, if we push this, it is not going to go well. But I'm an optimistic person, and I had this hope. I was like, surely they will listen to us.
We're so amazing. They won't want us to leave, right? They wouldn't lose us over such a position. Because I think those things too, right? Like, in my economy, I wouldn't break. And to the point, you weren't, even though your conviction was different and you were only asking for this, and your conviction may have been, we don't believe in any of this, but we're still doing this.
Right.
You were willing to compromise and stay.
Yes, we were.
Right? For the
Yes.
sake of those relationships.
That's exactly right. We were. And I'm not sure now that we're out of it, I don't know
Right.
if that compromise was really a good decision on our part,
Right.
but it was really hard for us to see. We were so deep in the forest, we couldn't really see very far outside. And so now we have a bigger perspective.
So it's these moments in our lives like this, and I've lived through different similar kind of scenarios. Sometimes the pain is so significant, but once you're finally out, you can look back and say, that was a rescue, right? There was
Yes.
there was a mini rescue salvation for me in that moment that didn't feel like it at the time.
Yeah.
But now looking back, I'm grateful that they shoved us out the door, because it's brought us to some new life.
Yes, it certainly has. It has. It opened up our eyes in a way that I don't think our eyes would have been opened. Although I have to say, we still grieve the losses
Of
that we have.
course.
You know, I still
Yeah.
have big empty holes in my life
Yeah. No,
that
it's not
I
easy.
wonder. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but yes.
I actually have a question I'm going to ask you about that for advice that you can give others
Sure.
in similar situations. So, if just because we're on it, do you mind if I just jump to that really quick, and then we'll kind of
Perfectly
jump back
fine.
in? I've likened these moments to kind of being voted off the island.
Yeah.
And I've found that there can be, church hurt is significant, right? And so when we find these moments where we have a disagreement within our church communities and we're having to separate for whatever the issue might be, and I think there's a lot of people a lot of Christians going through this for a variety of different reasons right now. What hope do you have? Even though, again, those relationships are relationships you'll grieve. But is there hope off the island? And how have you negotiated that, and what has been helpful for you in making those decisions?
Oh, that's a really good question. When it first happened, and when we realized that we were voted off the island, and that it was a matter of time, we mostly were just kind of going through the motions, trying to get through this really hard thing. And we didn't give much thought about what was going to happen when he was no longer at the church. And so it kind of hit us like all of a sudden we had no place to go. And this was a very weird, we'd been in ministry all of our marriage, both of us had grown up in the church, and suddenly we didn't have a home.
Right.
And I know a lot of people feel like that. And I remember we were driving somewhere, and my husband said, what if we just start going to a lot of different churches, not even looking for a church? He was like, what if we just go to all the different churches we're never able to go to, even ones that doesn't even matter if we are going to agree with them or not. Let's just go see. And so we spent the next several months doing that. And it was one of the most refreshing things to my soul, because what we saw Christians in all sorts of different spaces, in different faith traditions, from different backgrounds. One of my favorite churches we went to was a Korean church, where they invited us and we shared a meal with them afterwards. And my son had no idea what kimchi was until he took a bite of it. And
So
it
delicious.
was, but
Yeah.
yes, it was such a refreshing time for us to do that, because we realized that the Christian world was bigger than where we knew that in our head, but it helped me know it in my heart, that the Christian world was bigger. And so, I think a lot of people, when they get hurt by church, they just walk away. And my advice is walk somewhere else. You don't even have to choose that place. Just go to different places, go see different people, go learn, go sing different songs.
Nice.
So if that maybe helps a little bit, I
love
think,
that.
Yeah, it was it really restored us.
And to
doing that.
even go to places where the services might be in a language not your own, to
Yes.
be able to hear how big God is. God is bigger than the North American church. God is bigger than these different strains of Christianity here. God is bigger than English. God is bigger than, God is just
Yes.
bigger than all of that. So there's a lot of life to
Yeah.
be found there. That's very helpful. I appreciate that insight. I think sometimes when we're starting to get voted off the island, it's such a painful experience that
Yeah, it is.
we try to start to continue to crawl our way in. We're like, no,
Yeah.
I still have travel documents. I
Yes.
have, I still believe, especially for egalitarians, right? Like, I still believe in the Bible. I still love Jesus. I'm totally for
Yeah.
mutual submission. And we find ourselves sort of backpedaling a little bit and trying to continue to somehow figure out which power systems we can continue to prop up that can help
Right.
people feel comfortable with our presence and feel comfortable with what we're questioning.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really work, does it? And
No.
I think I'm a little bit concerned. I'm interested in your thought. How much do we continue to prop up that power system by deferring to it in that way, rather than simply at some point, and this might, I don't know if it's helpful for any, saying, I don't want my tourist visa to this island anymore. There's this life over here where everybody's being invited in and people aren't being voted off the island. And I kind of think Jesus might be there too. And
Yeah.
I'd like to go see that. I had a friend one time, I was really lamenting the fact that somebody was upset with us about something and was kind of like writing off all of us, right? Which I should be used to now. It's happened from the moment I was 13 and I said I wanted to be a pastor, and there's a whole bunch of people that's like, that's it, you're out. In my church, it was fine because I grew up Lutheran and Presbyterian, but amongst neighboring churches, it was not. But I'm still not used to it, even though it's happened to me my whole
Right.
life. And I have a spiritual gift of stubbornness. I'm still not used to it. I don't like it. I like pleasing people and I don't like the fracturing. But a friend of mine said, Danielle, you don't want to be on that island anyway. I was like, oh, you're right. And just the frame of like, they're not going to like you anyway. No matter what you do, your very essence is not going to be accepted. I was like, okay, all right. And it just helped me to remember that there were other beautiful places to visit and places to make home. So I really appreciate
Yeah.
that encouragement for everybody just to go out and find another story.
Yeah. No, it was very helpful to us to do that. And it also helped us reaffirm what was important to us. And so I think that is, it was very life affirming in so many ways and gospel affirming in so many ways.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a tendency, particularly now in our national conversation, to make these very clear distinctions, like Christianity is this, and it's all evangelical, right wing this, or it's all, left wing progressive this, and we just make everything stay in these own little spaces.
Right.
But God's just so much bigger than that, bigger than the ways we talk about it. And I'm hopeful that if people find that they want to reject certain parts that they're seeing of a nationalistic Christianity, I would say, good, reject that. But know that Jesus is bigger than that. Jesus speaks to it. And there's been a whole bunch of other churches, I'll brag, like Spark included, that aren't doing that. And so I think we just don't make the news. But there's a whole bunch of other life-giving churches that you visited in that time that provided hope and life. And you guys have found a church home now, right?
Yeah, we're actually at a very small church. My husband is pastor. He never really saw himself as being a pastor. He always wanted to be in youth ministry, but God put us here. Definitely. He's a social work major, and there's a lot of things he's able to use. He's able to use a lot of his training and his gifts, and it's a really great church that it's going through some really hard times, but the people there, I think, give me a lot of hope.
Nice.
And so we're very, some of them, the faith that I have seen in many of our congregants is just really fantastic.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad. Thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate that. Let everyone get to know you a bit better and encourage you to go read the full story in her book. Well, my next question for you is that the subtitle of your book is How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And this is really the weight of your book and the argument and how you handle all this. Your chapter on Making Biblical Womanhood, Gospel Truth was fantastic. Explaining how that complementarian belief system has become a litmus test in some circles of Christianity. Like, if you don't believe this, then you're not a Christian, right? You've thrown out the Bible somehow. You don't take it seriously. You don't take Jesus seriously. So how was the paradigm of biblical womanhood constructed? And how did, in some Christian circles, it become inextricably linked to being a Christian?
Yeah. So there are sort of two parts to this. This is big question, but I think I can answer it for you. The big part, and I think this is the part that we really miss a lot in our narrow late 20th, early 21st century context. And that is that when we think about egalitarianism, we think about women in leadership, we think about it as something that was fueled by the feminist movement of the 20th century. And what we don't realize, and so we see the reaction, churches often see themselves where they're not allowing women to lead. They see themselves as being countercultural. And what I really tried to do in the book was broaden this out and say, you know what, y'all, actually not letting women in leadership is not countercultural. It is what the world has been doing from the very beginning. I mean, this is just patriarchy. It is just sort of a new version. And so I tried to help, really see that we're not being countercultural. We are actually going along with the flow of the world, and that it's never been good for women. Unfortunately, however, in the 19th century, if we think about when complementarianism began to be gospel truth, the story really starts in the post-Reformation world. And in the Reformation, a sort of interesting thing happened where the highest calling for women became tied to their role as wives and mothers. And so the highest thing that a woman could be was to be married. And to be married in the Western European world was to be under the authority of your husband. And so women's spiritual calling got placed underneath the legal headship of their husbands. And so this sort of became the norm for Protestantism for much of the Western European world. When they carried it to the US, this was still part of the norm as well. But women, and this is another thing I try to show in my book, women never really sit still for patriarchy. Women always speak out against patriarchy. I tried to tell many stories throughout the book about women. This isn't just modern feminist women saying something's wrong. Women have been saying something's wrong all the way throughout.
Right.
And so I wanted, and in the 19th century, women began to say something is wrong. And it's interesting, this became the first wave of feminism, and they began clamoring for the vote. They also began clamoring for leadership in the church. There was actually a lot of women preaching at this time. Right. But something interesting happens in the church. We begin to see translations of the Bible begin to write women out of leadership. And I tell this story a little bit more, but a good example is Junia, and you told me you have some Junias in your church.
Yes.
It's wonderful. But in the 19th century, we begin to see Junia in Romans 16. She begins to be translated as Junius, not because the biblical text thought that really shows her to be Junia. I mean, there's no evidence. And in fact, we know that there's not even people named Junius in the first century world. The only reason they began to translate her Junia was because it was a problem for them to deny women leadership while a woman in the Bible is named to the highest spiritual position in, the early, it's not really an early church, I suppose at the time it's beginning to form, but she's an apostle. So they had to do something so they start writing her out. And this is actually something that we see. It really, as I said, it starts in the 19th century where we start to this emphasis that women should not be in leadership, that the only time that women are in leadership is when something has gone wrong with the system. And so this sort of evolves we get to World War II, when women are finally pushed out because of the war, and they begin to take over the spaces, and they begin to work and do a wonderful job, and the men come back home and they need their jobs back. And it is no accident at this time we once again see the church sort of respond by trying to put men back in the jobs, women back in the home. And we begin to see an emphasis on biblical texts that emphasize female subordination. And we also begin to see the emergence of, in the 20th century, two sort of teachings. One's called inerrancy, and people think inerrancy means that you trust the Bible. What inerrancy actually means is that you have to read the Bible a way a group of early 20th century white guys read the Bible. It's sort of, but
and chose to translate it in a language,
translate it. Yes, in a way that writes women out of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they said, you don't believe the Bible if you're not an inerrantist. And then the second thing is they begin to argue that the subordination of women was tied to the Godhead, and that women were called to be subordinate because Jesus was subordinate to God the Father, which is heresy. Which, inerrancy is really troubling. The way, I fully believe the Bible. I fully trust the Bible. But inerrancy was created in a particular moment. And so I'm happy to say, I'm an inerrantist if you mean that means you believe the Bible. I am not an inerrantist if you say that means you have to believe it the way that, 20th century fundamentalists believe it. Right. So, but the heresy bit was sort of the linchpin for this whole thing, because the reason they had to do it was because the arguments that patriarchy came before the fall were really not working. Because theologically, patriarchy is a result of the fall. It's really
textually hard. Right.
It's really hard to get around that. You also can't write Junia out of the Bible. You can't write Phoebe out of the Bible. And so it was sort of like, from my sense, it's a last-ditch effort, that the way to make this is to be like, women are subordinate because Jesus is subordinate, and that's gospel truth. So I tried to summarize for you really fast.
That was brilliant. Okay, and so what I wrote, scribbled furiously as I was reading that portion of your book, because you heard that heresy preached.
I did.
And it wasn't just that you were thinking, this is not working for me, just practically speaking in terms of roles at this church, but the subjugation of women actually then corrupts the rest of our theology as we read our text, and we have to continue to try to force our text to do crazy things.
It's ironic.
It's so
that's
crazy.
That's what they argue about egalitarians.
Right.
Yeah.
I've often asked people, do you want to be a Genesis 1 and 2 person or a Genesis 3 person? Do you agree that there was a curse reversing death of Jesus or not? Right. I don't understand why we're like, wow, women can totally make childbirth easier. Hey, men, no problem. Use whatever tools to make that. But that whole lording it over her, we're gonna have to keep that in. That's just the way God made it, right? It just doesn't sit with our text. And when you talk in the book about this moment for you where you're hearing about the subordination of the Son, and you're thinking, this is not Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity, and this is actually in direct conflict to our creeds. I wrote at the top, this is what happens when we don't know our history, and also as a Lutheran Presbyterian, when we don't say the creeds. Yeah. Because the creeds have more than just, I believe these things. I always, as a kid, it kind of saying them every Sunday, it built a shelf for me. So then when I got into more non-denominational church settings in my early ministerial career, it felt like I was like, does nobody else smell the heresy? I really thought we believed in the Trinity. And it took time. I was almost like, no, the Holy Spirit was born at Acts 2. I'm like, no, that can't be a thing. Has to have been around a long time before. So I really appreciated you tying that, because I think sometimes people feel like, well, those women are just talking about it because they want to talk, or they had a personal investment in the role, rather than understanding this is something that's impacting men, women, how we view Jesus, our entire interpretation of the text.
Yes, it is. No, you're exactly right. And that's why that moment where I write about...
I'm sorry, Beth, I think I've lost you 1 second.
You've lost me?
Did you mute?
I'm sorry.
Or is it?
I still hear you. Is anything fine?
Are you back?
Can you hear me? Am I not back?
Oh,
oh no, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Beth, everyone. I'm going to take a few moments to look at your questions as we get reset back up. Can
you hear me okay?
We can't hear you.
You can't hear me. It's not the button this time. Okay. I'll do what I did before.
Okay. Is it us here? All right. Are we back?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Beth.
Yay, okay, it's not me. I went back to see my settings.
We're all good. Fine. I think it was on Skype. It was not you, or we're all good. we'll talk to. Oh, and somebody else said they could hear us both. It was just me. There we go.
Okay, well,
That's great.
For a minute. I was like, oh, no.
Thanks, everybody. That's really helpful. Okay. All right. We'll get back to it all. Thank you guys so much for your comments online and for sticking with us. Okay. Beth, we were talking about the larger heresies that get involved and how it impacts anything. So just thanks for speaking to that. And if there are other places that you've noticed that in the church, how it impacts our marriages, how it impacts women who aren't yet married or don't want to get married.
Yes, that's a huge one. I mean, that's one of the things I think about this emphasis on what complementarianism has done. And a lot of people are like, well, in fact, I saw this debate, some people are like, maybe we just need a new word. Complementarianism isn't working anymore. The Danvers statement isn't great. We just need a new word. And I thought, well, or maybe we just need to ditch patriarchy. Maybe the problem is just this, when we say that women are less than men, and when we say that women's spiritual identity is tied up in being a wife, it really makes no room for women who do anything else. And throughout history, I mean, this is one of the things people don't realize, is that even though women have always gotten married, a lot of women always have not gotten married. A lot of women have always done other things. And, the medieval world, they became women religious. And there were actually a lot of single women running around in the medieval world, which people don't realize that there was a significant portion of single women. And there was space for them in the medieval church. In fact, single women were seen as being closer to God, more so than wives, because wives had sort of succumbed to the sexual. I mean, it's not really a good theology either, but nonetheless, just showing that it's different. But we have written a space out for women who do not fit the mold of married with children. I mean, even women who suffer from infertility or women who don't want to have children. There is not a space for them in many Protestant evangelical churches because of our emphasis on the male-female model of marriage and how that mirrors, God's best or even possibly the Trinity.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think there's a lot to consider with all of that. Okay. You talk in your book about your complicitness, your willingness to remain silent until the moment of pushing. I very much appreciated that. It's so hard. I think it's something many of us can relate to, whether it's regarding patriarchy or white supremacy and all of that. Why is it that why do you think it is that women and men continue to go along with that support of that system and what really seems to be like almost a betrayal of Jesus's ministry and Paul's rejoicing that in Christ Jesus all are one?
Yeah. Well, for me, a lot of it was I was afraid. I was afraid of what it would mean for me and my family. Especially when I wasn't quite sure where my husband was on it, when I was starting to see the disconnect and I was like, oh my gosh, this really isn't, this is not biblical. We're reading something into the text. And at first I was even afraid, even though, my husband, we've had he's a fantastic partner with me. But I didn't know sometimes where he stood on this. Sure. I was afraid. And of course, my fears for that, obviously it all was fine because he listened to me, which is fantastic. But a lot of women don't have that. Right. A lot of women don't have spouses. They're in marriages and their spouses maybe don't listen to them, maybe do see it as really dangerous if their wife even says something like that. I think fear is a lot of it. I think fear for what we're going to lose, fear for our relationships. That was part of it too with me. There are women in that church that I still love, that I spent a lot of, we had our babies together and they were my friends. And those friendships have never recovered from what happened, and so I think that's a lot of it is that fear of what we will lose. And also the question of, does it really matter? And this was the one too, because, well, does it really hurt anything? Women who don't, you can maybe go somewhere else, or you can use a gift in a different way. Does it really hurt? And one of the things that kind of pushed me out of that, and this was one of the very first blog posts I wrote, was one that I also incorporated in the introduction. And it was when the Paige Patterson, all of the allegations against Paige Patterson really started coming out. And it really hit me hard, because my thought, and in fact, I titled my post this, I said, Paige Patterson is my fault too, because I realized that he got away with it because I was comfortable and because I was afraid for myself. And there was, I'm a medieval scholar, and one of the texts I talk about in the final chapter of the book is by a woman named Christine de Pizan. And Christine de Pizan stands up for women in the 15th century. And she has this wonderful letter that she wrote. And essentially, she tells the story of a woman who is abused by her husband because of some of these dangerous ideas. And she says, for that, it's for that woman, because that woman is hurt, it means essentially I need to speak up. And that always stays with me, and it kind of haunts me. And I'm like, when even if it's not hurting us, when it's hurting our brothers and sisters in Christ, you can think about with racism, it's like, God calls us to stand up. And so.
Yeah. It reminds me of the quote you have in the book: the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing Christians that oppression is godly. Yeah. That God ordained some people simply because of their sex or skin color or both as belonging under the power of other people. Yeah. That women's subordination is central to the gospel of Christ.
Right.
And it's such a powerful statement. It also reminds me of Tony Campolo in 2003 said, opposition to women in leadership is evidence of demonic influence. He got so reamed for such a statement.
Yeah.
But I think that the point that you're making here, that oppression is not godly.
Right.
And you've tied it here to race as well. And I wonder if you might not speak to how patriarchy and the subjugation of women is deeply connected to white supremacy and systems of racism.
Indeed. This is, we talked about what was left on the cutting room floor, and this was why there was so much more I wanted to do with race in the book. But I was, it would have become a different book if I had done that. And so, my editor wrote, I think this is a different book, Beth. And so I kind of cut all those things out. But the problem is that patriarchy and racism go together. The reason we can't get rid of racism is because we haven't gotten rid of patriarchy. And the reason we can't get rid of patriarchy is because we haven't they really go together, because the heart of them, and if we think about it in our context, in our American context of racism and patriarchy, it comes from European imperialism, in which European imperialism said, look, we are the better people as white people. We are smarter. Think about the Age of Enlightenment, where they begin to come up with all these ideas that women are less intelligent because our heads are smaller and things like that. This all feeds into it, where they begin to examine the way people's bodies are made, and they, presumed that white people are superior. And so then when they moved out into the other parts of the world and they took them over, they were like, we are better than these other people. We can show them how to live. We're going to introduce them to our customs, and we're going to introduce them to our God. And while it is, I think the gospel of Jesus, I do want the gospel of Jesus to go out to all the world, but I don't want it to go out to the world in a way that says it's because I'm better than you that I need to bring it to you. And that's really was the attitude of a lot of this imperialism. And this imperialism was buttressed by scripture. They used scripture verses, they used the household codes. And while they, in order to make the household codes say that slavery is okay, they also then, to literally interpret that, they also literally interpreted wives belonged under the power of their husbands. This also buttressed up their government system, in which they literally, I mean, women were literally under the legal authority of their husbands. When they got married, they rode away. They didn't own money. They didn't own property. It was all under the power of their husbands. And this was also the way they treated the slaves. And so it really, I mean, it is in the heart of this emphasis, this buttressing of white male authority. And I know we don't, you know, my son's a white male. So, I mean, this is my world. But I want him to realize that while he is beautiful and made in the image of God, he is not made more beautiful than anyone else. And so.
And we're not talking about individuals, but systems, right?
We are talking
structures and powers and authorities that have been set up to function, to constantly benefit one race or of another, one gender over another, rather than, I mean, nobody's throwing your son under the bus for all of white supremacy.
You know, and that's what people don't separate very well. You know, we tend to take it as a personal attack on ourselves when we say that there are structures in place. But I mean, if you think about the structures in the world in which women who do the same jobs as men always make 70 to 75 cents less than men, and this is a constant, this is a system. If you think about, if you think about Black people in America and how much less they make than white people, this is a system that is disempowering them. And so just because we're calling out a system doesn't mean that we, as you said, we're throwing individuals under the bus. We're saying, let's stand and fix a system together. And that, I think, is very godly.
Well, and it seems central and core to Jesus's ministry with his upside down kingdom, and to the ministry of Paul as well.
Yeah. The economy, I remember I read that somewhere, that the economy of Jesus is not the economy of America. And that really I was like, you're right. You know, Jesus spends time with all the people nobody else would spend time with. He doesn't care about money. It's his economy is different. Right. So why is our economy the same as the world's? Right.
And it hasn't always been, right? There, as you do so well in your book, you highlight the moments within our church history where it wasn't this narrative, and do such a good job of explaining how we are in this moment right now. But it is a relatively, patriarchy is not new, but a relatively new moment. And there have been other moments within church history where things have been different.
Yeah. Well, what I argue is that patriarchy shapeshifts. And so while patriarchy is always there, it conforms to the different cultures that we live in. And as Christians, we then conform our patriarchy, we conform the way we treat women, not to the Bible, but to our world around us. I mean, this is one of the pieces of evidence that that patriarchy is not biblical, because the way we support patriarchy changes. In the medieval world, we supported patriarchy by saying that women's bodies were flawed and there was something wrong with women, and that's why they couldn't lead. And so only women who escaped their bodies could lead. And so this is why we get preachers, female preachers and teachers and renowned women religious in the medieval world, because they escaped their bodies. They gave up being married. They gave up being mothers. They devoted themselves to God as women religious. And one medieval sermon that I, read, it says, "Women and God be men." And so it's sort of this idea that women can become like men, and that allows them to have spiritual authority. But that fit the medieval world view that they inherited from the Greco-Roman worldview, whereas today our patriarchy has shapeshifted to fit the emphasis on the wife, on the elevation of the role of the wife. And so now that is the thing that biblical women are supposed to aspire to.
Right. And you demonstrate this very well, even just talking about biblical translations and the reaction to the TNIV with gender inclusive language, and the ESV coming out. Instead, it's the only Bible I've ever returned. And so I opened it up and said, oh no, put that aside. But so I think your efforts in the book, for all of you who have not yet picked it up yet, please go pick it up, because the information you'll get is helpful just to understand our framework of where we've come from, the voices that we can hear in between, and the places. So with all of that, Beth, we want to thank you for your time and grab to maybe a few of the questions people have.
Sure.
The
yes.
one upvoted on top on Slido is, in your research, have you found churches that have successfully moved off of conservative positions? And are there any characteristics that enable a successful or healthy transition in that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, there are. But it really takes a concerted effort takes a concerted effort by the leadership, by whoever, the pastors are, to be willing to listen and to be willing to consider. It also takes a concerted effort on the congregation to be willing to take time. And, one of the best ways for churches that make this transition, often it happens by women being put in leadership positions like teaching or being made deacons or something like that, where suddenly people begin to see them. When you just start seeing women on stage, it
right.
all of a sudden, that's, if you think about a lot of churches where you just never see women in any of these positions. And so why would they think women could do these things? But if you can put women in places of visibility. I will say, however, that even though I know there are some churches who have made this transition, in my experience, what often happens is that people just leave. And the church, which is sad in many ways, because then the churches that once maybe had more diverse viewpoints become much more entrenched in their way of thinking, because all the diverse viewpoints leave. And that's one of the reasons why I tried so hard to stick it out, because, I thought, I'm a good example. I provide diversity here. But it's really hard to do that. So I think you have to have people in key leadership positions who support you, and who will support, discussions, fair discussions on it. So it's hard. It can be done, but it's hard.
Thank you. Next question coming in is biblical womanhood a uniquely American evangelical phenomenon? And if yes, why? And if no, then what does that suggest?
Yeah. So I think biblical womanhood, the way that we have, is uniquely Western. I'll say that. Maybe it is Western. What we have in the 20th and 21st century is uniquely American. And the things that I think are unique about it are, in many ways, the emphasis, the emphasis on the married family and the male leadership, which is also European. It sort of was imported over, but then it didn't maybe stay so well in Europe. But it imported over and became uniquely American. And then, of course, also, the Americans did all sorts of weird things with it, like with how we redid purity culture, which I talk about in my book, too. We become this really where it is now on the burden of women to keep men from sexually misbehaving. And that's really the idea behind purity culture. And this was sort of, historians have talked about this as the cult of true womanhood. It's the American version of the cult of domesticity, which has a lot of parallels, but it also took on some interesting American emphasis, which got tied up with Southern culture.
Wow.
And so which makes it not just distinctively American, but distinctively Southern culture, which has also has a lot of racist parallels in it. Yeah, there's been some. I'm obviously not an American historian, but there's some really fascinating work that has been done on this. It's also why Baptists in North America are often much more open to women in leadership than Southern Baptists, even though we're all Baptists together. It's a cultural difference. So
it's a question I've always had about the connection between abolition of slavery and suffrage, because so many, like Quakers in particular and others, were activists for both to occur and kind of were told you can only get one. So they worked on abolition, but still held on to suffrage ideals. And it felt like in the South, there was a reaction to that once the abolition of slavery went through. They're like, we're not going to let you take our women. It's like a bearing down on a huge cultural shift.
Well, I have a friend, and I've quoted her before. I won't quote her name, but she said, well, when they couldn't have slaves anymore, they had to have power over their wives. And sort of this doubling down on patriarchy in Southern culture. And it also became a mark. I mean, this is the thing that also makes it distinctly American, is that most people cannot have the husband be the sole breadwinner and the wife stay home and take care of the household and the kids and not do it. I mean, most families cannot afford this. It is only it is only upper middle class, mostly white families that really can afford this. And so that's too. It's it doesn't work when we take this idea where the wife, this picture of James Dobson's, holy household, really, where the wife is at home with the children and taking care of them, and the husband comes home from the public space into this private space. I mean, this is not something that works for most families, because they simply do not have the economics to do it. They simply, I mean, it's just not a realistic thing. And so in some ways, it's not just American, but it's white elite Americans.
Wow.
So anyway, there's more to that question. I think maybe I answered a little bit of it.
That's amazing. That's a lot to unpack. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we call them Dobson household codes now and not just the household codes? It's distinct.
I've tried really hard. I've had to pray a lot about my attitude toward Dobson. My best is that maybe he just didn't realize what he was doing.
Sure, of course. Yeah. Hold everyone in grace and also continue to fight for justice. Yeah.
Yes.
One last question, and I'm not sure how you feel about this. How do we reconcile women who are in leadership in the ancient Hebrew history and in the Hebrew scriptures, as well as within the New Testament, with the current patriarchal culture and theology?
Yeah, well, I think the fact that this is one of the points I've tried to drive home in my book is that women have always been leaders in the church. It doesn't matter what we call them. Women have always been leaders in the church. Women have always preached. Women were clearly deacons and apostles in the early church. The medieval world recognized women in leadership, even women in leadership over men. One of the other people who got cut from my book is a woman named Hilda of Whitby, who oversaw a double monastery in England, and which means that she was over men as well as women, and also oversaw one of the major early councils of the medieval world that decided the date of Easter, and it was a woman. And so, and then we have preachers like Hildegard of Bingen, as well as Catherine Breckus in her book, Strangers and Pilgrims, talks about all the preaching women in the American landscape, and the Black women preachers, the Black women preachers. I mean, their sermons are astounding. And
you referenced a specific book, right?
I did, Daughters of Thunder. I love the sermons that are in Daughters of Thunder. It's unfortunately a book that's out of print, but maybe if enough people talk about it, they'll reprint it. But yeah, it's fantastic. So I think what this shows us is that, I mean, it's really what changed my mind. What changed my mind was Romans 16. It was when I realized that women were leaders in the church. And so no matter what Paul's saying there with women be silent, he cannot be telling women to be silent for all times, because women were not. And he allowed women to be leaders. And so I don't think we can reconcile women have always led does not fit with modern patriarchal ideas about women in the church. And so when we have a broader perspective on what women have been doing, and when we look beyond our modern American context, then we see, we just see that God has always used women and recognized their leadership.
You say in the book that the subjugation of women is a historical constant, but that doesn't make it divinely ordained. Yes. And so all of the examples that you provide, I also appreciated you said, I can't believe we are still having this argument. You say it very much at the very beginning, I can't believe we're still having to have this conversation. And I love that you mentioned that you were going to tweet the medievalists. Like you were wondering if they had their own Twitter profile, what they would sound like. And I've thought the same thing too, often about the suffragists and the women mentioned in scripture. They're like, we've been here this whole time. Why do you think people are starting to listen now and maybe haven't been willing to listen before?
Yeah, I think 2016 was a really jarring year for for the U.S. The last 4 years have been very jarring for the U.S. because sort of all of the things that were bubbling under our surface all started exploding. And of course, it's been made more clear by simply social media is that you can't get away with things anymore. Police brutality they can't really get away with it because somebody's there with their camcorder. Not camcorder. Listen to me, with their cell phone. Somebody's there.
Right.
watching it. And so I think we have realized that something's wrong.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, that's the thing I hear from a lot of women is they realize, something's wrong. They don't know exactly what it is. But in fact, one woman, just today sent me a whole Twitter thread, talking about how she felt like she was, suffocating and just didn't know what was wrong, thought it was her. And you just hear these stories. We knew something was wrong. We see it, all of the sex abuse scandals, the Me Too movement, which became the Church Too movement, the collapse, Paige Patterson, all of these major male leaders, Ravi Zacharias, just the fall of them, the horrific fall of all of them. Something's wrong with our theology that has been buttressing them up. And so I think people suddenly are like, what's wrong? If either I'm going to walk away from my faith or I'm going to say we've done something that has moved us from the course of Jesus. And so I hope most people are like, we've moved off from a course of Jesus. How can we correct that course? And so I think those people are listening.
Yeah. Well, certainly your book helps to articulate that for us and gives the words and the information we need, along with Kristen Dumais' book and others. We're just so grateful for all of your hard work to make all of this come to pass and provide all this information for everyone. Your book opens with the phrase, "I never meant to be an activist."
Yeah.
And I just wanted to thank you for being one. I think you're in good company. And I think the disciples, the women of Romans 16, Paul himself would be very grateful to have you on their team. And I'm just really thankful for you sharing your work and your passion and your expertise with us. I wanted to give you the last word, and hopefully you can send us off as you do all of your classes and at the end of the book.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, when I got to the end and I was like, how am I going to end this? And I thought, you know what? It's just time for us to be free. So just go be free, because Jesus, that is the message of Christ, is that we are one in Christ. So.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to all of you for jumping in and for your comments and questions. We're thankful for your participation and for contributing to the important conversation. I want to encourage everyone to go and get Beth's book, share it with people that you love and care about who agree or disagree. I hope you can just dive into it. Beth is very available on social media for wonderful conversations. So please follow her in all of those places. This video will continue to reside here on Spark's YouTube channel, so you can come back or share it with others as you like. We hope you have a great rest of the evening.
Thank you.
We also wanted to let you know we have some other fun events coming up, so hope you can join us again. Thank you so much. And thank you, Beth, for everything.
Thank you.
God bless you all. Thanks.